This portion of your tourism and local events channel, Discover Pittsburgh Country, is brought to you by Allegheny County, a great place to live, work, and play. By the Pittsburgh Zoo and PPG Aquarium, where the wildest place in Pittsburgh is open year-round. And by postgazette.com. What's going on? Discover Pittsburgh Country is sponsored on demand by Comcast. Hi, I'm Leslie Merrill, and welcome to another edition of Discover Pittsburgh Country. Now, today we're in one of my favorite spots in all of Pittsburgh Country. And I know I always say that, but I really mean it. This is not your ordinary dusty history museum. Proudly affiliated with the Smithsonian, the Senator John Heinz History Center offers a really dynamic experience of our region's past. In fact, the core exhibition is called Pittsburgh, A Tradition of Innovation. And we're going to check that out in just a few minutes. But right now, we're in an exhibit called Clash of Empires, and with me is my very good friend Andy Masick, President and CEO of the History Center. And Andy, it's so great to see you as always.
Well, it's good to see you too, especially here at the History Center, Pennsylvania's largest history museum and an affiliate of the Smithsonian.
How does Pittsburgh fit into the birth of our nation?
Well, you know, when we think of the birth of our nation, we often think of George Washington, the father of our country.
Of course.
And he first came to Western Pennsylvania in 1753 as a 21-year-old, 6'3" tall, red-haired, gangly Virginia youth. And he came here to cast out the French, who were building forts along the Allegheny River and in what they then called the Ohio country. The first person that George Washington wanted to meet was Tanagrisson, the Seneca half-king, as the British called him. And Tanagrisson was a great war leader. We can see that by the scalp pole across his face. Each of those tick marks represents a scalp that he's personally taken in combat. This is the guy George Washington needs because he's got to have allies to chase out the French, who are already building Fort Duquesne at the forks of the Ohio, where the Allegheny and the Monongahela come together. They're building this star-shaped fort. It's actually rectangular, and this is going to control the western waters. But it's not so easy. As George comes back with an army, he realizes that the French are stronger than he is. So in 1754, George Washington came back to Western Pennsylvania with 300 men, and he built a little stockade, which became a fort of necessity when he was surrounded by French and Indian forces. And this is where the French and Indian War really began, and it all started in the backwoods of Western Pennsylvania.
Now I've got a question. This is George right here.
That's George, yeah.
Does he have his teeth there or wooden?
He has a full set of teeth when he starts this battle, but by the end he'd lost his first tooth, and by then they started going pretty quickly after that.
No kidding.
So by the time he's president, he's got a full set of dentures.
Wooden dentures. Yeah. All right.
George had the worst day of his life at Fort Necessity in 1754. He's only 22 years old, and he's about to lose his first command. The French send him a message, all written in French, of course. George doesn't speak a word of French, which says, if you don't surrender right now, we're going to kill you and every man jack of you. And it also says that you started this war by assassinating a French officer. And George, in truth, a week before had surrounded a small French encampment and opened fire on Ensign Jumonville. And that started the French and Indian War. Well, George ends up surrendering his first command, but he makes it back to Williamsburg, to the provincial capital of Virginia, intact and with most of his men. And then he comes back to Western Pennsylvania, this time with General Braddock in 1755.
I'm seeing how Pittsburgh's playing a part in all of this.
Let me take you to Braddock's field and see what happened that day.
Let's go to Braddock.
Here's how it went down, Leslie. It was July 15, 1755. The British troops marched across the Monongahela River. It was only knee-deep that summer, about where Kennywood is today. And they marched up and hacked their way through the forest about where the Edgar Thomson steelworks are today, right through the center of the town of Braddock, which of course didn't exist then. The French and their Indian allies came out from Fort Duquesne thinking that they were going to fire a few volleys and maybe just show the British that they were here, and then they were going to bug out. But that's not the way it happened. The French volleys backed up the advanced British troops, and the redcoats compressed their files in the narrow track in the forest. It was a shooting gallery as the French and Indians fanned out on both sides of the British column and poured a devastating fire into the redcoats. George Washington was there. All of the British officers with Braddock were either killed or wounded. General Braddock himself was mortally wounded. Only Washington survived, and it was up to young Washington to rally the troops, get them back across the river, back to Fort Necessity.
How did he survive to become the father of Pittsburgh? Just wondering.
Well, he did survive that day on the banks of the Monongahela in 1755, and he came back to Pittsburgh in 1758 with General Forbes. And the British forces marched to the point, found the smoldering ruins of Fort Duquesne, and Forbes turned to Washington and said, well, what are we going to call this place now? And they both thought about it for a minute, and then Forbes, who was a Scotsman, said, well, why don't we call it Pittsburgh, kind of like Edinburgh? And that's why Pittsburgh has an H on it to this very day. Well, that's really the founding of Pittsburgh.
Yeah, Pittsburgh really changed the map of the world.
It really did. And then for the last 250 years, it's continued to change the world through innovation.
We'll be back in just a few from the Senator John Heinz History Center. But first, here's WQED's Rick Seaback with a little bit more about what makes Pittsburgh, Pittsburgh.